Bueno, pues aquí estamos de nuevo. Vamos a introducir la ponencia inicial, que es con Evgeny Morozov, que no es solo uno de los críticos más relevantes del mundo de la tecnología, y desde que hace ya una década publicara su obra sobre solucionismo, yo creo que pronto nos va a sorprender con otra obra donde ya no solo retrata el solucionismo desde un punto de vista más filosófico, ético, sino una crítica total a la economía capitalista desde un punto de vista distinto y seguramente crítico con el materialismo y con el medio de producción descrito por Marx. También es fundador de la plataforma de curación de contenido de Syllabus, que es la forma de llevar a la práctica una especie de utopía y de alternativa distinta a la manera en que organizamos la información y el conocimiento de manera distinta a Silicon Valley. No es el clickbait de Facebook, no es lo que más me gustas consigue de Twitter, sino una plataforma donde se indexan decenas de cientos de piezas cada día y donde se ofrecen artículos de verdadera calidad en torno a 60 temas. Ya os dejamos con Evgeny. La conferencia, como sabéis, será traducida en castellano y en inglés. Y bueno, buena suerte.
Okay, thanks. So I will speak in English. Thank you so much for this introduction, Kaiz. I hope I will not disappoint. So essentially, you have to be patient with my line of argument because as Kaiz has mentioned, I've been working now for many years on a book, and it looks like I'm in the final stages of it. So the book should come out or be finished at least relatively soon, but not, of course, all of those ideas can be communicated to you. Okay. Good. So let me not sort of beat around the bushes then. So I will just try to go into the heart of the issue. But again, I warned you that a lot of those thoughts, I'm still refining them and they will eventually appear probably in a somewhat different form. So I've been asked to talk about how we can go beyond or exit from digital capitalism, right? And this is where I think it is worth reflecting a little bit on just what this term digital capitalism is and whether it's actually a valid framework of analysis, right? And I think that it's not a trivial point at all. We have to be very careful not to create some kind of an intellectual political ghetto where there is this digital capitalism which runs on its own logic, and then there is this kind of nicer and older capitalism which has all of its older logics and mechanisms, right? And I think that there is a tendency to somehow treat this new digital sphere as exceptional and somehow standing outside of the logic of capital, of the logic of finance, and of the logic of essentially broader economic developments of the last 50 years, right? And I think it's extremely unhealthy. So what we need to be doing instead is finding ways to reinscribe this digital capitalism back into some kind of a narrative, historical narrative, cultural and political narrative about capitalism as such, right? I don't think that it's a particularly deep or important point, but I think it's fundamental that we contest, for example, this idea that there is always something structurally different about digitization, which somehow opens a new age, right? I think this is a very unhelpful way to think about it because it tends to essentially convert many of the rather contingent features of our current digital society into some kind of unwitting celebration of the genius power of Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, right? And let me give you an example here. If you look at the rise of companies like Uber and Airbnb, right, it's obvious that you can tell two stories about the way in which they managed to undercut traditional providers of services like transportation. So we can stick to Uber, for example, right? It's obvious that the story that Uber would like to tell about itself is a story about digital capitalism being so much more efficient and slicker and essentially kind of more sustainable, perhaps even when it comes to emissions, than the old capitalism, right? And this is where they will spin these narratives about digitization being the key that opens all doors. And Uber and the likes of them are just in the kind of avant-garde of these trends, and they're just riding this wave of digitization. Right, so this is one story, and I think that by accepting this narrative of digital capitalism, we are essentially, in one way or another, we are contributing to this reification, if you will, of digital capitalism as a standalone kind of separate track phenomenon. But another story to be told about Uber is that all these lower prices and costs that they are charging, it's not a function of them mastering the arts of automation and digitization, but in fact, it's just a matter of a certain configuration within global capitalism where, after the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, you end up with a lot of idle capital, which cannot really go anywhere else. It cannot easily go into bonds because essentially, the interest rates are either very low or negative. It cannot easily go into the productive activity because they themselves are having a lot of trouble and uncertainty. So that capital finds its way into the likes of Uber, into the likes of Airbnb and all of those platforms. And for various reasons that have to do with the need to maintain valuations of these firms artificially high, billions and billions of dollars are burned, every year to essentially subsidize the rides of passengers in Uber cars, right? So here, a story that emerges about this so-called digital capitalism is a very different one, right? It's a story intricately linked to the crisis of capitalism in 2007. It's intricately linked to, the normal dynamics of capital seeking the most profitable outlets and needing to essentially sustain artificially inflated valuations. And you end up with a story that essentially completely recasts this narrative about hyper efficiency introduced by these algorithms into a story of hyper inefficiency of many of these companies kept on life support by forces of global capital that essentially had no other outlet to go to after 2007, 2008. Occasionally, we get glimpses of this narrative. When you have spectacular collapses, like the collapse of WeWork, for example, right, which is still there, but it's barely the company that was celebrated by venture capitalists and sovereign wealth funds and the international media, right, where its valuation was skyrocketing high and its profits were actually non-existent, right? So I'm just saying we have to be very careful with not making it easier for the capitalist firms to get away with the narrative that they would like to spin. Now, the question I think that we really have to be asking is somewhat different. So it's not about digital capitalism as such, right? The question should be, okay, so now we are in 2020. We are in Europe and we are essentially stuck with a certain number of factors and constraints, right? So we have, on the one hand, a very interesting political process going on, where the politicians, for various reasons, are outsourcing and delegating more and more responsibility for functions that were previously tackled by the state, by the bureaucracy, but also by civil society. They're delegating those functions to the tech sector. Right. So, and I've been demonstrating that and describing that, now for a decade, and to some extent, the term solutionism was supposed to cover that. So that's the unstated background of this constant delegation kind of in the background happening, right? But that's not the only background condition that I think we need to put on the table before we can think how we can exit digital capitalism, to stick to that term for a second. I think the other important condition that we need to put on the table is the fact that the left as such, doesn't really have a vision of what a non-capitalist future would be like and what kind of non-capitalist future it wants, right? And until we manage to articulate what that future should be like and in what way it should be different from the previous futures wanted and to some extent built by the left in the Soviet Union or somewhere else, we would not come to any positive vision of what role technology could play in that process. And that would not give us any normative orientation as to how today's technological environment differs from the one that we really need for that political project, right? And this is why I think that the low-hanging fruit, right, and which is so tempting for us to go and start picking, it has to do with the agenda that is purely defensive and to some extent regulatory, right? And this is what's happening in Europe at the moment. Since the left doesn't really have a plan, not just for technology, but for the future in general. And I'll be happy to defend that provocation as much as I need to. They basically get on the bandwagon of regulation and of trying to, in one way or another, tie the hands of the big tech, right? Or make them pay taxes, or make them comply with GDPR, or make them comply with the right to be forgotten, and so forth, right? Or we find a way to kind of tie them and tether them to the objectives and imperatives of the Green New Deal, right? And I think that in as much as this is kind of a reasonable project, there is no need to worry about signing up to some of those declarations. It's just that this is not really, as far as I see, a project of the left, right? To some extent, you can say that it's a consequence of certain social democratic responses or reflexes, if you will, that are still present in our body politic, but it does not adapt to any meaningful political project, right? But again, it doesn't adapt to a meaningful political project with regards to technology, because the same project with regards to politics at a much higher level is missing, right? And this is why I think the left faces a number of choices and options, and it's around those options that much of our political debate should evolve, right? So if you look at some of the kind of initial impulses to transcend this relatively conservative agenda of just making sure that big tech kind of knows its place, right? If you want to put it that way, and that maybe in Europe, we develop our own capacity that will mirror the American one, but will perhaps respect European rights and regulations in a much more forceful manner. So what is the most immediate way to kind of transcend that? Right? And you can possibly argue that a lot of people on the more radical strands of the left, they thought that perhaps the world of big data and the world of sensors and algorithms and infrastructures that would allow us in one way or another to kind of recover and rediscover planning, right, as an alternative paradigm through which we would be able to contest the victory of neoliberalism. Right, and I think that quite a lot of stuff has been written in the past few decades, even before we started talking about big data, but especially in the last decade or so when big data became a very important public term. A lot has been written about sort of ways in which planning of the new type. So we will not be kind of reinventing the Soviet experience, but we would be building something else entirely, maybe transcending some numerical or purely numerical forms of planning and moving to something else. So, there's been a lot of debate on how that can inform a new project of the left, right? I personally, having thought about it for a while, I have some doubts about the viability of that as a political project, not a technological project, right? So I think technically we can debate to what extent you can now have a planned society built easier, if you will, with so much data at your disposal, right? And you, of course, do softer forms of planning. You can do simulations, you can do kind of analysis scenarios. I mean, you can do all sorts of things which would not necessarily add up to full-blown planning, but would nonetheless help to make decisions that are not entirely shaped by the market, right? So you don't need to default to full-blown planning, if you will, to take advantage of this non-market affordances, if you will, of big data. But that, to me, still doesn't sound like a very exciting political project, in part because I think it doesn't really solve many of the problems and many of the original challenges that earlier communist experiences, particularly those, in Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, and to some extent, of course, China, ran into, and they have to do, of course, with the concentration, immense concentration of power within a certain technocratic bloc of the state, and the inability then to essentially involve citizens in a meaningful way in decision making that pertains to economic decisions, right? So in that sense, I think deep inside the Marxist project, there still remains, or at least in the most orthodox manifestations of it, there still remains this residual belief that somehow the technological and the economic, what we used to refer to as forces of production, that somehow follows a logic that is purely technical, and that with enough, if we just remove the constraints imposed upon the technical and the economic by the imperatives of capitalism and by competition, we would be able to organize it in the most efficient manner, right? And then all of the political decision-making, etc., it will happen in the political sphere, and we will essentially involve people in all sorts of democratic decision-making, but that democratic decision-making should not in one way or another impinge upon the technological, which just ought to be organized according to the latest science, and I'm giving you a very kind of banal, I think, but to some extent also accurate description of how this mentality to a large extent still operates. And I'm just not sure that in its original formulation by Marx, but also in its subsequent take-up, if you will, or uptake, in various regimes that followed, I'm not sure that it was ever accurate to branch out the technological in such a manner and draw this definitive separation between the technological that can be organized using rational and scientific methods, and then the political where, through free association of producers, we would be able to arrive at a certain democratic decision making, right? So for me, the problems, to be honest, they start at an even deeper level, and it's with the paradigm of production itself in Marxism, right? And I think that, I'm not going to go into the critique of the paradigm of production, but I think that there is something, and let me rephrase it. So what the last 10, 15 years has revealed, and I think that the left has not fully grasped it, is that when the left complains, for example, about digital labor being unfairly compensated, right? What the left usually refers to is not actual labor, right? I mean, it's a shortcut through which they can account for the fact that somehow these digital platforms have managed to valorize the activity, the creative activity of people on those platforms, and they manage to produce value from it, maybe extract some, value in kind of not in the Marxist sense of the word. They manage to extract data somehow from those activities, and maybe they manage to convert that data into artificial intelligence, right? That would be the kind of utopian vision, right? But if you buy into those premises, right, and a lot of people on the left do, because that's what they need to buy into in order to articulate this paradigm of digital labor. If you buy into it, you immediately realize that there is something very interesting going on, where our everyday communicative, creative, artistic activity, in a way, is productive of something, but it's not actually properly contained in the paradigm of production, or at least the way in which Marx initially conceived of it, right? As a very specific type of activity upon nature, right? And this is where I think we just need to understand that if we really want to go and transcend this idea that we can somehow organize the economic and technological activities through rational means and then apply some kind of democratic decision-making in the political sphere, if we really want to transcend that dichotomy between the two, then it's obvious to me that we have to start from the assumption that to some extent all activity, it's not to say that all activity is productive activity, right? So it's not a matter of kind of blowing up this fetish of biopolitics that a lot of people in Italy, for example, are very obsessed with. It's not that, but it's finding ways in which our everyday creative potential and our everyday social activity can be inserted into institutions that will be economic, political, and technological, that in one way or another will allow us as a society to develop and reproduce, right? And that, to me, will open up a lot of avenues which will be very different from those where the only thing we can do is to find out how it is that we can compensate workers for the fact that there is artificial intelligence now that is going to potentially kick them out of jobs, even though I'm sure you'll hear later that that's not actually what's going to happen, right? So for me, the kind of missing debate right now is a debate related to sort of what is it that the last 10 or 15 years of us engaging with these digital technologies have revealed about flaws and faults in our underlying analytical frameworks, right? And here I think it's almost imperative that we get a different analytical grip on what it is that we want technologies to do, right? And it also means, to be honest, and here I don't really have time to go into a lot of detail about it, but it also means that we will need to produce an entirely different philosophy of history if we are really serious about Marxism being something other than just some kind of a body of that theory which manages to analyze reality using the concepts that are left over, by Lukács or whoever, but that actually doesn't tell you anything about history itself, right? Because that was the most radical part of the original Marxist project, right? The most original part there was its predictive nature, right? Was the idea that essentially as modes of production develop, certain conflicts arise, certain inconsistencies arise, certain classes arise, and then the interplay between those three leads to certain other problems, right? And in the ideal case, through class struggle, it leads to new modes of production, etc. Right? So that was the most radical part of the Marxist project. And if you were to poll people today who claim to be Marxists, to what extent they actually believe in those premises and assumptions, I'm not sure how many of them would actually agree that that's what's going to happen, right? And if you don't really believe in it, then I think you're just operating with a kind of, as I said, with a that theoretical apparatus, which can produce magnificent essays, but its value as a political program is minimal. In that sense, I think we don't have to think what could potentially replace the mode of production as a theoretical paradigm and whether anything should replace it at all, right? And this is where, I don't know how much time I have for that, but anyway, I'll kind of hint at where I think we should be heading. So I think if you analyze the entire neoliberal response to communism, right? And if you analyze kind of the Hayekian and the Misesian response, but especially the Hayekian response to the entire literature on planning, right? What emerges from it, in my interpretation, is a very effective reframing of capitalism as essentially being a superior mode of discovery, right? So the neoliberals basically look at capitalism, right? And they tell you, well, capitalism is good, and it's good because it allows us to discover things in a way that other regimes, including socialism and communism, don't. Right, and of course they don't really have, meaning neoliberals, they don't really have a very sophisticated concept at play here, right? So if you read the original essays that Hayek wrote even in the 30s, for him it's a matter of solving the economic problem, right? So there is nothing there about culture, there is nothing there about society. Of course, those things got added later on, but essentially it's a way of discovering things that happen in the world. And essentially then adjusting society automatically to them, right? There are certain costs to this discovery, but by and large, to use capitalist framing, it grows the pie for everyone, so it has to be accepted. And I think that if people on the left were really smart, what we should have done was to essentially say, okay, so let's assume we do buy this framing of capitalism as a mode of discovery, which is better than all the other modes, and then to essentially try to scrutinize it and see whether the discoveries it promotes are actually as good as their proponents claim, but also to analyze to what extent those discoveries and the kind of institutions and structures that promote them actually enough for us to survive some of the greatest challenges that are facing us, including that of the climate catastrophe, right? And if you were to frame the question that way, and if you were to systematically analyze the sorts of discovery that capitalism promotes and the sorts of discovery that capitalism either underdevelops or suppresses, you will end up with a relatively critical view of capitalism, right? And we can easily see that essentially it's interesting, and this is where it kind of gets somewhat into my critique of solutionism, but you can see that the kind of solutions that capitalism promotes, they are in a sense very truncated but also very peculiar in nature, because they all in one way or another look back and refer back to the need to essentially promote accumulation, right, or stabilize it. So most of the solutions that it can sanction and it can kind of accept are solutions that help capitalism expand, right? So to some extent, solutionism, it's the formalization of this process, right? But clearly, these are not the only ways for us to discover things about the world out there, right? It's not a way for us to discover new and innovative practices which are impossible to monetize, right? For those, there is no formal mechanism within capitalism to uncover them and to scale them up, right? So you can only do that around practices that look profitable to some entrepreneur. But if I discover something that doesn't look profitable to me and doesn't look profitable to anyone else, but it's nonetheless socially useful, that will probably remain underdeveloped and will disappear into the void of history, right? And this is how capitalism works, so you can develop all sorts of ways of mutual social association. You can develop ways in which people relate to each other differently. You can invent all sorts of institutions which do things differently because they suspend, for example, certain rules and regulations relating to property rights, right? And we have plenty of such institutions in history, libraries, universities, post offices, whatever, right? All of them do certain things which don't neatly fit into the need for capitalism to keep on accumulating, and gradually they wither away, right? So if we were to reinvent something like the library today, we would probably end up with Amazon charging you for every single word that you read on the books that you borrow, right? That would be a modern day friendly institution to fulfill that particular need. So what I'm trying to say and what I'm getting at is that if you were to properly actually scrutinize capitalism as a mode of discovery, as opposed to a mode of production, within the terms that neoliberals themselves have put forward, you will see that its performance is relatively meager and actually quite weak, right? And this is where I think whatever alternative we are to articulate to capitalism, it would be nice to start by realizing that above everything else, we need to make sure that we survive, right? And we need to survive the climate catastrophe to begin with. So whatever alternative mode of discovery, if we really want to stick to that paradigm, would emerge, it has to be able to uncover and institutionalize the kinds of practices and institutions and solutions that would help us at least to grasp just how badly we are hit and how we can get out of that mess, right? That would be a nice kind of very basic prerequisite to a counter paradigm, right? But then I think we have to basically think a little bit in other dimensions, right? So how is it that we can institutionalize discovery of not just new facts about the world, right, but also new practices, new structures, new institutions that can then be infinitely revisable, right? Because ultimately, true democracy would mean that. It would mean removing structural impediments from the revision of existing institutions so they don't get naturalized, right? And then on top of that, of course, we need to find a way that this process of perpetual discovery, if you will, and perpetual revision, in one way or another is generative of what in the old framework we would call value, right? So it's obvious to me that there has to be some mechanism through which our creative everyday social activity, it's not just wasted and thrown away, and it's not just in a few of its bits and pieces monetized by this solutionist paradigm of Silicon Valley. We need to make sure that this immense creative capacity that we all express, and that we would express maybe even more and in even deeper ways, if only the digital infrastructures were not actually configured just to the function of capture, but were also configured to the function of invention and destabilization, if you will, then we would be able to build some kind of a very different way of capturing what today we would still call value, and making sure that it contributes to the reproduction and growth of our society, right? And that, I think, would be a very different theoretical but also political paradigm, where obviously we would need to have a clear idea what kind of technologies we would like to have, and we would be able to specify at a normative level, what the right criteria with regards to the ownership, with regards to the plasticity, with regards to the reversibility would be, right? Because to me, it's obvious that technology, it's very banal, and a lot of people say that technologies have politics, and and that this particular artifact might be contributing to racism, etc. All of that is kind of true, banal, and because of science and technology studies, well accepted. But what we don't say, and what we don't see, and what we don't always acknowledge, let alone operationalize, is the idea that technologies also help us disclose, revise, and overthrow certain political arrangements which before revealed themselves or showed themselves to be natural, right? And this is where you just have to think about a project like Science Hub, which many of you might be using to download academic papers, which, if you think about it, it's a genius revolutionary technology, which in a sense has profound political effects in that it reveals that the normal regime of academic publishing that we take for granted very often, and we think that that's a fair arrangement in society, is actually deeply unfair, and it keeps politicizing it, right, to a point where public opinion changes and the old paradigm is overthrown and a new paradigm emerges in its place, right? So if you were really to think about a radical kind of form of society where things will work differently, the normative question we should be posing with regards to our technological infrastructures is, what is it that needs to change in their ownership, design, ease with which we can revise and rebuild them, so that there are more projects like Science Hub, so that we move from this radically, no, not radically, but relatively instrumental technologies to technologies that dissolve power and that reveal that certain laws and other technologies that we take to be completely normal are actually just congealed and frozen social conflict, right? But the ease with which such technologies appear, it's clearly not random. That there are certain factors and there are certain elements in our infrastructure and in our technology policy that make some of them more likely to appear and survive than others, right? And it's through those projects then that we acquire an extra political lever through which a different kind of society can be brought into existence, right? And I use the examples of Science Hub, but you could have easily used the examples of WikiLeaks, for example, right? Where again, we can argue and like, of course, we can see that in the current world, the radicality of WikiLeaks to some extent was a function of them enjoying some protection from a nation state, as opposed to certain parts, you know, of technological infrastructure being more amenable or less amenable to the radical agenda. But nonetheless, I think we need to problematize that agenda, right? And what I've proposed, and I know that I'm running out of time, but what I have proposed, maybe in a very meandering and somewhat confusing manner, was to link, right, this set of new normative criteria for deciding and designing, right, this alternative infrastructures to a radically different political project. Because I think that if we don't fill in that space of the political with something exciting and something that actually lives up to the theoretical challenges opened through, you know, last 100 years, we'll just end up with a very unappealing agenda that seeks to mobilize technology for a project that itself is quite moribund, if not dead. Well, it's the same thing, right? And this is something to avoid. So I'm just, you know, in closing, I would just like to encourage everyone to maybe, rather than jumping on these questions of how, you know, a different technology policy can be articulated and how Europe could react differently to the US or to China, to think a little bit harder about what is the actual content of this project of the left. You know, it's of course very easy to go for this natural reflexes and say, you know, our job is to protect workers and the working class. So, you know, that's our project. Right, but in itself, to me, that doesn't sound like a project. That sounds like an algorithm inherited from, you know, years of struggles, which I have nothing against, but it doesn't necessarily translate into a political project. Right. So again, I apologize if some of this was too theoretical or abstract, but I hope that I have at least indicated that, you know, if we really want to get out of digital capitalism, we need to understand what digital non-capitalism is, right? And so far, unfortunately, I don't really see a strong understanding anywhere what it is. And, you know, reflecting upon some of the debates and about both digital socialism or digital communism, I don't really see the sort of radical theoretical breakthroughs that we really need in order to give substance to those terms beyond just trying to reimagine, you know, what these old ideas would look like if you were to throw in some platforms or smart cities or algorithms on top, right? It's not a matter of prettifying and modernizing those projects. It's a matter of actually filling them in with content, which they currently do not have. And it might sound provocative, but I'm quite convinced that by and large, other than a defensive agenda of defending rights and the welfare state, the left at this point doesn't really have a project, right? So sorry to leave you on such a depressing but hopefully realistic note. But I think that whatever technological project would emerge has to take note of that void and try to fill it in before giving some kind of a definitive blueprint of what an alternative set of technologies should look like. So thank you.